I don't know if you've seen this week, but I feel like week 6 of lockdown, which is what we've just done, is has been the week of the jigsaw. A lot of people on my social media seem to have cracked out their jigsaws. I actually got a new jigsaw for Christmas, so I've only done it once. Haven't managed to crack it out this week, but maybe next week's the week. But I don't know about you when you do a jigsaw, especially if you do it with a few other people at the same time. You get the box out, and then everyone has their own idea about how you should start. So some people are like edges and corners are straight out, all round the edges, make the edge first. Some people are more kind of people who turn all the pieces over in the box the right way around first. That's very important so that you can see all the pieces. It's a great way to start, a great first thing to do. And other people might go for a particular area of the jigsaw. There might be a really prominent colour. I've been doing a lot of princess jigsaws with my household this week. We always go for the princesses first because they're the easiest ones to find in the box. And that's another great way to start, another brilliant first thing to do. But however you do it, you have to do something first. And you will instinctively know with the jigsaw what the right thing to do is first. We're facing some big stuff, even bigger stuff than my 1,000-piece Christmas jigsaw. We're facing some big stuff and some big challenges, and lots of that is out of our control at the moment. Maybe your exams have been cancelled, maybe all your activities have been put on hold, maybe you're finding it difficult to interact with people, difficult to help people, difficult to get stuff done. Productivity is like down low, partly because of our environments that make them less productive, or maybe just our physical and mental health are really being affected in this season. There's lots out of our control. But equally, there's some stuff that we do have control over, but sometimes it feels hard to know where to start. It's not like a jigsaw where you do the edges or the princess bits or whatever it might be. It's hard to know where to start. And we're looking at a passage in the Bible today where God makes it really clear where to start. He makes it really clear what the first thing to do is. And Paul started our talk series on Gideon last week. Gideon's a character in the Old Testament in the book of Judges. And when we meet Gideon, and the Midianites, a neighbouring nation, have been oppressing the Israelites, making life really challenging for them. The Israelites are actually hiding and living in caves. And every time they do a harvest, all these other nations come and take all their food. It's a really, really challenging time for them. And God calls Gideon in the midst of all of this, and he says that he's going to deliver Israel out of Midian's hand. That is not an easy 1,000-piece jigsaw. That is a big, challenging task. And the first thing, I don't know if you've ever watched a few sports films. I've watched a few sports films in my time. The first thing that normally happens to an unlikely hero with a big challenge, they do a training montage. So there'll be like a lot of push-ups involved. There'll be like high knee things. They'll be running around. They'll be like climbing over walls, all that sort of thing. And Gideon doesn't get a training montage first. That's not the first thing God asks to do. And sometimes when people have to make friends in the neighbouring country, they might learn the language or gain some diplomacy skills. That is not what God asked Gideon to do as the first thing. What God asked Gideon to do as the first thing is to sort out his worship. He's got to get his worship right. And that's the title of this talk today. It's Get Your Worship Right. That's what God says to Gideon. Get your worship right. And we are reading in Judges chapter 6. And we're going to just read verses 25 and 26 to start with. That same night, the same night as God just called Gideon to save Israel from the Midianites, that same night the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering. So here we see Gideon and his father Joash are the characters mentioned in this part of the story. And Joash has an altar to Baal and an Asherah pole, like another pole to the goddess Asherah. And these are both gods who are worshipped by the nearby nations, but are not the right gods to be worshipped by Israel. God says to Israel very clearly, the first commandment when he forms the nation of Israel is to love God with everything you have and also to not worship anything else, not to worship any idols. And these would count as idols, something that is not what God has asked them to worship. And Joash has these in his house. And in these days, in the society, extended families would have lived together, and all the sons and their families would have lived with the father of the family. And so this is Gideon's house as well. This is where Gideon lives. This is his everyday worship, has this altar to Baal and these Asherah poles to Asherah. And this is his everyday worship, and it's not focused on God. That's not what he's meant to be doing. And God, the first thing God says is to tear it down, to get his worship right. Done so much for us, and he loves us so much that actually we can express that to God in worship. It doesn't have to be a celebration. Sometimes we feel terrible, and sometimes we're struggling. And God wants to hear about that too. And actually, sometimes when we come to worship with songs and words and music in that way, when we're having a bad time, God lifts us. He raises our perspective. He reminds us of his love for us. He comes to meet us with his peace, his good news to us. But worship is not just words and singing, all that stuff really helps. Our whole lives are an act of worship to God. Everything we do expresses how we feel about God, expresses to God what we feel about him, and how we act, how we treat other people, how we use our time, the things that we prioritize in our lives. Our whole lives are acts of worship to God. And I don't know about you, but at the moment I'm finding it very easy to hang out with my work colleagues, and I'm finding it very easy to hang out with the people I live with, and I'm finding it much harder to prioritise other friendships in my life and precious people who I love and are not getting to hang out with at the moment. And I did manage to do a video call with a friend last week, and we had a great chat. But imagine if I was trying to express how I felt about this friend whilst I was also like scrolling through my Instagram. I joined TikTok this week. That is so addictive. Scrolling through my TikTok, you have to like wait 10 seconds before you scroll on TikTok. Or messaging on my phone, doing my emails, or maybe like writing my shopping list for my big Asda shop the next week. She wouldn't get a very good picture of how I feel about her. If I'd tried to prioritize her and ended up doing all these other things instead. And that's what idolatry does. That's what we see with Gideon here. When you put something else in the place of God, when we worship something else, when we're designed to worship God, it puts our attention elsewhere. It makes it difficult to worship God. It makes it difficult to let him know how we feel about him, because we're focused on something else, or we're distracted by something else. But just like Gideon, we want to be getting our worship right. That's the first thing we need to do, like putting the edges in, like turning all the pieces over of that jigsaw. That's the first thing we need to do. That's our first priority. When I was 21, I had a really significant summer with God. And it was a summer where throughout the summer, actually, God really spoke to me about my worship. I was a student, so I had quite a long summer break, which was lovely. And I look back at it as the summer of prayer. That's how I sort of phrase it in my mind. It was the summer of prayer. I learned so much about prayer, speaking to God, spending time with God, listening to God. And it was a really significant summer. And in the July, I felt God nudging me to start praying for other people. And I hadn't really done much of that before. And I didn't feel very confident to do that. I've been a Christian a long time, but I hadn't felt confident to do that. And the reason I hadn't felt confident to do that was because I'd never prayed with my eyes open. I always felt if I had my eyes open, I'd get so distracted and I wouldn't be able to pray. I wouldn't be able to concentrate. I wouldn't be able to like sense if the Holy Spirit was near. It's funny what stops us doing things sometimes, isn't it? And I knew that when you pray for someone, it's really good to have your eyes open, because then you can be more connected with them and you can be better able to pray for them. And I was like, I can't pray with my eyes open. I can't possibly. Anyway, I had this nudge from God, and I went on some prayer ministry training, and I had a go at praying with my eyes open. It turns out I could pray with my eyes open. God had spoken to me and taught me a little bit more about worship. He taught me to pray with my eyes open, so I could, with a bit more confidence, pray for other people and encourage other people with what God had for them. That was July. In August, I felt God nudging me that I could be praying more with my friends at uni, with people at uni with me. I was at a sort of festival, a bit like our About Me holiday that will now happen next July, not this July. And I felt in the big meeting, main meeting, that God was nudging me to do a bit more prayer with other people at uni. And I wasn't sure about this, and I wasn't feeling very confident. I'd only just learned to pray for other people out loud with my eyes open. And I actually asked God for a sign. I sort of said, God, I'm hearing you, and I think this is you, but I'm going to need a sign to confirm that this is what you're actually asking me. And the meeting finished, and I walked out of the big marquee. And within about a minute, I bumped into somebody from my uni. He was a Christian, so it's possible that he would have been at this festival, but I didn't know he was at this festival. And I bumped into him and I said, oh, I've just felt God talking to me about doing more prayer at uni. And he was like, yeah, great, fantastic. And legged it because he was doing Hunt the Leader with the youth. But it's a really vivid memory. I'd asked God for a sign and he'd said that. And then I went back to uni later in the year and did some more prayer with people at uni. That was August. In September, I helped out in a new church that I hadn't been in before. I went to volunteer in a church, and the team there prayed together every day. The team there, their faith wasn't just about Sundays. This felt quite new and revelationary to me. I've been a Christian a long time, but I think I still was so focused on Sunday worship. And actually to be part of a team who prayed every day, they actually prayed morning and evening every day, just shaped my day completely differently, spending time with God, worshipping God. I learned a lot about worship. That was September, July, August, September. I got back to uni at the end of all of that. And in October, I was having a conversation with a church leader. And during this conversation, I realized that God might be calling me to church leadership, to be a vicar. And I was absolutely terrified. And actually, I've stayed terrified for about 2 years. And occasionally, even now, many years later, I have a few little terrifying moments. But the first thing I had to do, the thing that God had been teaching me the whole summer before that really significant conversation I had, he was teaching me to get my worship right. He was teaching me to learn how to pray. He was teaching me to have a go, get your worship right, so that I was ready for the challenge that lay ahead, the big scary challenge that lay ahead of what God was calling me into. Let's get our worship right. We're going to carry on and read into what Gideon did next. We're going to start at verse 27 in Judges 6. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. In the morning, when the people of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. They asked each other, who did this? And when they carefully investigated, they were told, Gideon, son of Joash, did it. The people of the town demanded of Joash, bring out your son. He must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. And you can start to see why Gideon was feeling a little bit scared. There's a hostile crowd waiting for him the next morning after he's tried to sort this worship out, get this worship right. And despite his fear, he still did it. He did it in the way that he could manage. And sometimes this stuff feels scary. Maybe you're here today and you wouldn't call yourself a Christian. At the moment, it feels scary to say yes to Jesus. It feels scary to start on an adventure with him. Lots of us are scared. That's okay. Sometimes the stuff feels challenging. Or maybe you've been following Jesus a long time, but at the moment it feels really difficult to put him first. There's so many other pressures and worries and fears just crowding in. It's making it difficult to prioritize God, to put Jesus first. But we don't need to be superhuman to do this. I always think if Gideon can get his worship right, despite the challenge of the Midianites and all these people waiting to kill him, maybe there's a chance for me. Maybe there's a chance that I can do it as well. Maybe we can put God first as well. Maybe we can make God our first priority, the first thing that we do before we embark on a challenge. And sometimes it feels like the unpopular choice. I think Gideon knew that this wasn't going to be a popular choice, tearing down these old ways of worship. Maybe it feels like you're the only person in your friendship group or the only person in your family who is putting God first sometimes. One of the ways that Christians have put God first for thousands of years is with their money. Our money is part of our worship to God. And I have not met a Christian who's been brave and courageous and generous with their money, generous in their giving, generous in their sharing with other people, who hasn't felt that God's honoured it, who hasn't felt that God's come through for them. They haven't felt lost because of that generosity, that they've known that God has come through for them and provided everything they need. And here we see that God comes through for Gideon. I'm just going to read verse 31 and 32. But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, "Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." So because Gideon broke down Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal that day, saying, "Let Baal contend with him." God comes through for Gideon. His father rescues him from the hostile crowd. Despite having lost his altar and his Asherah pole, he still rescues him, which is great. But Gideon's given this nickname, and the nickname means "let Baal contend with him." It's almost like taunting Gideon, like, just you wait. Baal's going to sort you out. And they're like waiting for Gideon's plan to fail. They're waiting for this worship not to work. But it doesn't. God is faithful. And we've got 2 more weeks of this talk series, and you'll hear what God's able to do in Gideon's life because he's put his worship first, because he's put God first in his priorities. And God's still doing that today. We're not going to regret putting God first. We're not going to regret getting our worship right. We're not going to regret turning back to God where we've found ourselves pushed away, or where we've been fearful, or where we've had so much else going on. It's been challenging to put our worshipping God as the first priority. There's loads of things that we might find ourselves worshipping instead of God. There's things like power and money and fame. There's things like achievement. And sometimes we put our identity in our relationships instead of in our relationship with God. Lots of things that make it easy to make it difficult for us to put God first. Actually, lots of those things are reduced at the moment. It's hard to feel productive a lot of the time at the moment. It's hard to feel like we're achieving things, like we're getting things right. Maybe for some of us, our financial situation, our possessions, feels more difficult than normal at the moment. Those things that we might be tempted to put our faith in, to put our trust in, to worship, are things that don't necessarily hold up in this time of unprecedented crisis. They're things that don't necessarily withstand this sort of event. But when we prioritize God, he always withstands crises. He's the one that we can absolutely depend on, absolutely trust to come through for us. Our identity, if it's in him, will never be shaken. But if it's in these other things, I mean, they're a bit like idols that we're worshipping, that we're putting our trust in. They may well be shaken. They are not going to last eternally, whereas God is. And I wonder what this means for your life. What does worship look like for you at the moment? It's not all about singing, but singing definitely helps. It helps get our worship right. Sometimes it's step 1, being present to God as we're speaking words of praise, singing words of praise, having worship music on in the background so it help us focus on him, help us let him know how we feel about him. Youth Wednesdays, you did this 2 weeks ago, worship over worry. You know all about this. But sometimes when we worship, it allows God's peace to meet us, allows God's presence to be more us to be more aware of God's presence. And even when we don't understand what's going on, God's peace is the peace that passes understanding. It's beyond our understanding. We don't need to explain it. We just need to accept it. And there's lots of times in my life, I love music. I don't actually like listen to music, but I like playing music and singing. There's lots of times in my life that singing has helped me get my worship right. When I was 15, I was given like a book of like brand new songs. They're really, really old songs now. They're so old. I don't know any churches who sing in most of them. But these brand new songs, and this book that I had with all the piano music in and all the words, I used it so much. I think I could still recite most of the words of those songs to you, even however many years later, because I used it so much to help me refocus on God. When I was 15, life was not easy, and worship really helped with some of those challenges. When I was at uni, when I went back after that summer of prayer, I was singing in a church choir, and this was really traditional and old-fashioned church music, not the kind of stuff that we might have Tim and Em doing for us on our Pattern Church Online. And yet, in committing to that choir, showing up on a Sunday and singing those beautiful words about Jesus, truths from the Bible, truths about how good God is, and letting the Holy Spirit meet with me. I've got so many precious memories from that year, actually, when I was facing challenge, and yet being able to commit to worship and be drawn into worship was such a significant point on my journey, on me getting through those difficult days, those difficult weeks. It's not all about singing, but the singing can really help. Let's get our worship right. Let's prioritize it. Maybe for you at the moment, it's about the attitude we come to worship with. Maybe like me, you need to put your phone down while you're doing pattern church online. Sometimes God does prompt us to message people during church, and that is worship. And sometimes we know that we're distracted and we know that we're not getting our worship right when we're doing that. Maybe it's about attention for you. It's about priority for you. And maybe it's about the Bible. I always turn to the Bible when I think of things that can help me get more connected to God, get my worship right. And maybe you want to listen to the daily patterns with us. So every day except Sunday, we're bringing out a short reflection on our social media feeds. And you'd be welcome to read along in John's Gospel with us. We're nearly at the end, but we'll start something new the week after. We've got one more week of John's Gospel. Maybe it's about reading the Bible, experiencing God's goodness in worship through that. Or maybe it's about our influences. There's stuff that you're watching, stuff that you're doing that you know isn't honouring God. And actually, you've got a choice to make. You've got a choice over what you do. And maybe God can help you reframe that today. But we're never going to regret turning back to God. We're never going to regret getting our worship right. I wonder what a difference it would make in your life if your first priority was something completely dependable, who was never going to let you down, who can withstand any challenge and withstand any crisis. I wonder what difference it would make to your day, your everyday life, if you chose to worship God instead of all the other things that get in the way. If you chose to prioritize him and be ready for him to bring peace into your life. I wonder what changes you might see in your faith, in your journey with God, if you were able to prioritize time with God, to let him know how you feel about him, to accept his love and accept his peace. And I wonder what difference it would make to Swindon or the place where you live, if you were secure, if more of us were secure in our identity in God. We were worshipping God, getting our worship right. He is trustworthy, and he'll get us through any challenge. And we were able to be standing on solid ground because we got our worship right.